Now, newly appointed Secretary of Parliament Xolile George has told the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure that repairs to houses of Parliament would cost 2 billion rands. Broken down, the costs would cover 1.4 billion rands for the new wing and the old assembly, and then the additional 600 million rand to replace damaged furniture, ICT infrastructure, and other facilities. Xolile George joins us now live here in studio to tell us more. Good evening, sir, and thank you very much for your time, and congratulations on your new appointment.
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to all the viewers of Newzroom Afrika.
So earlier in the year, I think it was around June, or maybe if not earlier on, the Speaker of the National Assembly had indicated that once the Kuha assessment has been completed, particularly on the technicalities of the damage that has been done to the buildings of Parliament, we will then have a clearer picture as to whether we are relocating or we are restoring Parliament. Now, you've come with a price tag of some close to 2 billion rands. Does that mean that report is now out? Are we clearer now in terms of our options as to where we go?
Well, Thabo, the report that you are mentioning that was commissioned by the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, and I think that needs to be clarified. It's not assessment commissioned by Parliament. Reason for that is that all buildings of the state, including Parliament, are managed by Public Works as the state landlord. So even the buildings that have been damaged, the old assembly and the new wing of the National Assembly of our Parliament, the assessment carried out was commissioned by Public Works, and they appointed Kuha, as you mentioned, as it was indicated in January. And the report that has now been completed indicates the various options that will be done based on the assessment, the extent of the damage on each of those houses, what options can be done on each of the houses, whether it is restoration, it is reconstruction, and build elsewhere in terms of that work. Yeah. So the assessment has looked at those areas to say, within precinct of Parliament, if we were to rebuild a new wing, what is the extent of the damage? What are the cost estimates? Of course, estimates are based on informed technical analysis by multidisciplinary teams, and Kuha was the appointed agent by Public Works to assess how this work on a multidisciplinary basis. So when you look at the assessment done, it indicates what will be the cost drivers around restoration of the National Assembly, both its own wings, and what work needs to be done to connect it with the other house, yeah, which is the National Council of Provinces, that was partially disrupted in terms of network connectivity.
Okay. So I mean, if you're saying to us, when you look at what you've just articulated, item for item, line by line, in terms of the assessment and the options presented by Kuha, a restoration or a rebuilding or a reconstruction of Parliament would work out much more cost-effective than a relocation?
Well, we have not arrived at a determination that says relocation, because these are two concepts. Yeah. Restoration, meaning dealing with what you have.
Yes.
And we have to deal with what we have, because restoring a building of a heritage like our own Parliament, a national key point, it will require of us, even if we were to contemplate as a decision of Parliament as an institution, you still have to fix that institution. So the pros and cons of such a determination of relocation would require a full assessment separate, because you must identify sites, you must identify where, and take into account a broad range of factors, including the impact of where it is now in Cape Town. But also, Thabo, taking a decision like that would require a well-canvassed conversation with South Africans, yeah, because these are their own institutions.
Right.
So Parliament itself, in terms of its role, would have to make a decision that takes into account what are the consultative process that must be done, yeah, to make sure that if it contemplates relocation, what factors to take into account. We're now talking about just restoration of the house, right, and those cost drivers estimated are about that assessment.
Now let's talk about what you just mentioned now, because both the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker, when the news initially broke out of the fire, and of course there was a whole panic around whether or not the constitutional mandate of that institution is going to be hampered in any way by this fire. One of the two things that they said is that, well, symbols and buildings, yes, they're important, but that's not what makes Parliament. Has the work of Parliament been compromised in any way in this particular process, with all the numbers that we're looking at? I think 184 offices for support staff, 201 offices for MPs, I think 5 buildings that have got to do with the presiding officers. I mean, a list of numbers of what has been affected. I'm asking that because, for example, yesterday we heard that parliamentarians, members of parliament, who are the most important people in this equation, are saying our work of oversight is being hampered by this arrangement of a hybrid meeting with the president to answer the questions.
Of course, Thabo, the work of Parliament has been impacted, no doubt. But it's important for South Africans to also understand that the disruption that we suffered in January on the 2nd due to this fire is a continuation. It amplified the degree of disruption. Remember, all of us, institutions, people, society at large, we have been disrupted by COVID. So Parliament's disruption, firstly, like any other institution, started when there was a state of declaration responding to the pandemic that was visiting our shores. So it had to make adaptation, like any other institution, to make sure that where there's regulations of heavy lockdowns that we had, level 5 lockdowns, then of course there can be no gathering. Parliament gathers both at a joint sittings. It sits at plenaries of any of the houses. Committees of Parliament are many, and they sit simultaneously. There can be 27 committees a day. There can be 42 committees processing matters of legislation and so on. So it had to make adjustment, and it did, like any other institutions. Where we have the impact of the fire, it only exacerbated the problem, because we now don't have committee rooms. Members don't have offices. It impacted 473 offices. Offices of staffs are not there. Boardrooms of committee rooms were impacted in the National Assembly. So there had to be a shift to say that to the extent that there can still be physical part of few people, especially when regulations were now at least creating a leeway, numbers can go to 50 or 40, but those are restrictions. So you can't gather a National Assembly to sit and consider a report. So those adaptations are there. They did make an impact in terms of disruption, but Parliament has functioned. A number of processes that have been put in place have enabled Parliament. I mean, for instance, committees of Parliament, including sitting of houses, 375 sittings, have taken place just in a period between April 1 up until now. 375 sittings of physical and virtual in terms of the hybrid arrangements that we have in our functions. Committees have met. To the extent that now regulations have begun to come down, we have processed more than 41 budget votes that require processing by committees. There has been visitation of oversight in about 21 institutions, and there is laws that have been processed properly, more than 20 bills. As we sit now, as at August, we're sitting with about 51 bills that are being processed. So, yes, there is performance of Parliament, but it is not under the most ideal circumstances. So when you hear members saying, we are keen, when are we provided with permanent physical sitting, that's a very serious and genuine request. And ours is to make sure as administration, we work on options around this. And we have done assessment where we are looking at first dealing with the offices, make sure that the National Council of Provinces is able to function. And I'm glad to indicate that it is now functioning fully. After the recess, members have now set on a physical infrastructure of one house, although it is not the biggest of the two in terms of numbers, but it is sitting physically. We have identified offices now for our committees to continue sitting on a physical basis where our infrastructure allows for full physical sitting. But where it doesn't, we will continue on a hybrid model. Whilst we are looking at measures, Thabo, where, for instance, the State of the Nation that was delivered in February by the President of the Republic was done with an arrangement that we have secured as Parliament with the City of Cape Town that made it possible for the State President to deliver a sauna. And we now still don't have a building to say the National Assembly is restored. So it means there's agency to make sure that decisions that need to be made after thoroughgoing discussion with the Public Works Executive Authority, with our own executive authority, and be able to make a determination how to then take a well-canvassed and well-assessed policy decision that says restoration is the way to go, or any other option, to make sure that in the meantime, even if you were to talk, Tibos, on the question of restoration, on average, we'll have to take 3 years or 42 months to restore a building. So it means in the immediate, you would not be able to have access to use that facility.
Yeah.
Even if people work day and night,
do you have an extensive
damage that we have.
to-do list, even if we are going that route, in terms of the 3 years, on what it is that you're going to do? Because, I mean, you've already said it's coming in. What is your priority is to make sure that this oversight function is even more robust, even more effective as you come in. And one of the things that, for example, is a big issue that people are raising around parliamentary accountability is the question of professionalism, right? For example, we are hearing of late of leaked information that is quite critical. How are you ensuring that there is that degree of professionalism from the parliamentarians themselves?
Well, Tabo, there are rules for both houses. There's also joint rules for Parliament. They govern the conduct of members, how to manage proceedings. Similar like yesterday, you had rules that need to be applied and enforced by presiding officers. But it also requires a number of balancing acts to take into account a number of factors. And we do have jurisprudence in our country around a number of cases where the presiding officers would have been taken to court on this matter. So the Rules Committee is able to take lessons from those judgments and continue to revive rules so that circumstances that prevail in a sitting of the House strike a fair balance between allowing the performance of exercise of oversight whilst at the same time protecting the sanctity of the environment. So that as you do so, the decorum of the House is actually maintained and members conduct themselves in a manner that befits the status of members as well as the institution without sounding like limiting or curtailing their rights to express in a democratic form their right to question issues. So it's an ongoing work to strengthen that part. The issue of leaked information sadly would not only be applying to Parliament. Because of the virtual world we are in, you would have meetings, I'm sure you would have heard in many institutions, people will record online meetings and you start seeing circulated messages and footages of audios of what was discussed in meetings. Those are some of the difficulties that a virtual world sometimes bring in institutions. So Parliament would not be immune to that. But to the extent necessary, the degree to which the environment, both administratively and politically, the institution is improved to make sure that professionalism as well as conduct that befits the stature of the institution and status of members actually reinforces the decorum expected of any members.
Time always the enemy when I'm having a conversation with you, unfortunately. That's where we're going to have to leave it for tonight. We'll have you back for a much longer conversation around that particular work of Parliament. That is the incoming Secretary of Parliament there, Xolile George. Still ahead, we, of course, wrap up our women.